week 6 is our last and final week. And today we are going to discuss two things. One is fiqh during what we can call the golden age of Islam, the Abbasid Caliphate, the Khilafatul Abbasiyya. And second, the status and things that need to be done in the field of fiqh after the fall of Baghdad until now. The fall of Baghdad, which was in 1258 Common Era, that's 656 after the Hijri year. That was the fall of Baghdad, and we'll talk about that a little bit right now. But after that, until now, until today, December 16th, 2015, what has been done and what needs to be done. So, the Abbasid Caliphate, as we all know, that's the first four Khulafa, we studied their time. Those were Sayyidina Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiyallahu ta'ala anhu, Umar ibn al-Khattab, Uthman ibn Affan, and Ali ibn Abi Talib radiyallahu ta'ala anhu. With the demise of Sayyidina Ali ibn Abi Talib radiyallahu ta'ala anhu, it was the start of the Umayyad dynasty. In English we call it the Umayyad dynasty, and in Arabic the Umayyun. Umayyun are the Umayyads. That's Muawiyah bin Abi Sufyan radiyallahu ta'ala anhu. He was the first Umayyad caliph, and this marked the start of the Umayyad dynasty. Now, the Umayyad dynasty, after the fall of the Umayyad dynasty, in the next century, came the Abbasid dynasty, the house of Banu Abbas. This is the Abbasid dynasty, and the Abbasid dynasty was the longest ruling dynasty, the longest ruling house in the history of Islam. So the Abbasid Caliphate, it was established in the year 132. 132 after Hijrah. This is 749 Common Era. This is the start of the Abbasid dynasty, the Abbasid Khulafa. And this house, or this this tribe, this family, they ruled the Muslim world for 519 years. That's 519 Gregorian years and 524 years in the Islamic calendar. So this is the longest serving family. 519 years. They ruled for more than 5 centuries. So, of course, 500 years didn't pass, and it wasn't always the same. There were times of glory, there were times of weakness, there were times when they were attacked, there were times when they were on the offensive. 500 years passed. In 500 years, many things happened. So the entire reign of the Abbasid Khulafa, it wasn't always the same, but there were better days and there were worse days. And all of this culminated in the fall of Baghdad, which marked the end of an era. The fall of Baghdad, it basically marked the end or the decline of the Muslim civilization, if you could call it. And actually, the Abbasid Caliphate, if we look at it from a historical perspective, many people will tell you that the Khulafa Bani Abbas, the Abbasid Caliphate, it ended with the fall of Baghdad in 1258. But actually, 2 years later, or 3 years later, in 1261, the Mamluk Khulafa, they established the Caliphate in... Where did they establish the Caliphate? Some people were shaking their heads. They should know. Egypt. So these Mamluk Khulafa, the Mamluk Caliphate, they were actually a reminiscence, they were a remainder, if you can call it, of the Abbasid dynasty. So they had a different name. They were known as the Mamluks, but they were the same people. They re-established their hold on Misr, which lasted for another 250 years almost. So it didn't end necessarily in 1258. It lasted for almost another 250 years. Now, before we proceed any further, we have to study the difference between the two dynasties. The two dynasties meaning the Umayyad and the Abbasid dynasties. Because there was a difference, and this difference, it played a fairly central role in the development of fiqh, and not only fiqh, but also many other sciences, not all Islamic, many Western sciences, medicine, astronomy, things like this. All of these things, the attitude of the Khulafa of Bani Abbas, the Abbasid dynasty, it played a very central role in the development of these sciences. So, let's start with the Umayyads. What was the Umayyad? If we look back on them, they were an expansionist people. The Umayyads, they were very concerned with expanding the horizons of the Muslim empire, and they did. They conquered many neighboring lands, and this was what was happening during the time of the Umayyads. Another thing that we see that was very it was a hallmark of the Umayyad dynasty, is that they were, we wouldn't call them racist, but they were pro-Arab. So they didn't like to have any non-Arab influence in the Muslim lands. So anybody that is put in a position of power, he has to be Arab. He can't be a non-Arab. They were very proud Arabs. And they were from Quraysh. Muawiyah bin Abi Sufyan, even in the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he was from a very noble family. So the Umayyads, they were noblemen of the Arab community, but they were very strong in this, that they didn't let any non-Arab influence enter the Muslim lands. And this, not just in matters of power, even in matters of cultural practices. They were very, they safeguarded their culture. They expanded the horizons of the Muslim empire. They went to Persia, Rome. They went all the way to the European shores. But they didn't let the culture of these newly conquered people influence their own. In fact, the first Arab coinage was developed by Abdul Malik bin Marwan. Until then, they used to use the coins of Rome as their official currency. They didn't have a currency of their own. Abdul Malik bin Marwan, he was the first one who initiated a Muslim Arab. The word Arab is very prominent here. Currency to be used in Muslim lands. And until then, the currency was the Roman currency. That was the coins that were used. Yes.
What's the significance of Abdul Malik?
Well, Abdul Malik bin Marwan was after Yazid. So he was, let's say, about 50 years. I don't know the dates exactly. After Muawiyah. Not even 50, maybe just 40.
Before the Umayyad?
No, he is in Umayyad Caliph. So we're trying to see how the Umayyads had a very Arab flavor to everything they did. So one of the other things they did is, in that time, the official records were kept by scribes, the records of governance. And these scribes, they were usually Roman. So the language, the official language of these documents these records that were being kept in Arab nation were not in Arabic a lot of the time. Because these scribes, they didn't write the Arabic language. They wrote their own language. And Abdul Malik bin Marwan, he was the first Khalifa who initiated the record keeping in the Arabic language. That the coinage has to be Arabic, the records must now be in Arabic, and nobody who is not in Arab can be in any position of influence or power within the Muslim empire. Now the Abbasids, on the other hand, it was totally the opposite. They came into power relying on the Persian influence. So naturally from day one, or even before day one, there was a very heavy foreign influence on the Abbasid Khulafa. And this played a very large role in the coming years. The Abbasids, they were very open, and the Abbasid Khulafa, there was a movement that many of us might have heard of. This is the translation movement. that literary works and works that contained a wealth of knowledge from other people, they were now under official patronage. They were now being translated into the Arabic language. And along with these works, not everything that these works contained was very great. From an Islamic perspective, they contained many ideas that were very different to what the Arabs they were brought up to believe in and what the Muslims themselves believed in. And this led to a very heavy influence on many circles. This translation movement, it actually had a role in the development of what we now know as Ilmul Kalam. Ilmul Kalam is, to put it straight, is the study of aqaid. Ilmul Kalam, aqaid and beliefs were not something that was studied separately before the development of Ilmul Kalam. They were studied while studying the Quran, while studying the Hadith. The aqaid were imparted and nobody questioned beliefs. That you believe in this? Yes, we do believe in it. But as the translation movement it progressed onwards, a lot of foreign beliefs were now entered into Muslim civilization, and the Muslims began questioning a lot of their beliefs, and they were asking for proof now because of these things that they were reading from other places. This is something that wasn't happening before. Nobody would ask for proof regarding the oneness of Allah. Nobody would ask for details regarding the qualities of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. These were things that were unheard of. But now there were questions, and the scholars, they stood up to answer these questions, and the science that resulted is what we now know as Ilmul Kalam. The science of Kalam. Kalam means the mutakallimin are the scholars that deal with their specialty is the aqaid, the beliefs of the Ahlul Sunnah. And the reason this had to be done is because now there were people within the Muslim empire that were being influenced by these outside ideas, and they were now sticking their own interpretations of the creed. That this can't be because it doesn't make sense, so let's interpret it in this manner so that it appeals to our rational minds. And this wasn't something, this isn't how the aqaid are explained. So things like this. So this is the Abbasids. Basically, they were very open. Many foreigners, people who weren't Arab, they were in positions of influence in the Abbasid dynasty, and there were even rulers, governors of various places. The Abbasids themselves, they were Arab. But many people in positions of nobility and influence, they were not Arab. They were Persians, they were Romans, they were people from other countries. So this is how the Abbasids, they played their cards. And the Umayyads, they ruled with an iron fist. We talked about the Umayyads. They put in charge governors, the likes of Hajjaj bin Yusuf. We all know what Hajjaj bin Yusuf did. And he is one of the few men in history who is known to have killed 100,000 men, many of whom were senior companions of the Prophet ﷺ themselves. So the Umayyads, they ruled with an iron fist. They didn't tolerate dissent. Dissent was not tolerated. You didn't agree with the Khalifa, you're either going to jail or you're being killed. This is how the Abbasids, the Umayyads, this is how they ruled. And this is generally how expansionists rule, that they can't be worried about people that are going to stab them in the back if they want to expand the horizons of their empire, so they deal with them with an iron fist. And this is, the Umayyads are not alone in this. Many expansionists, people who were very concerned with expanding the borders of their kingdom, this is how they dealt with their citizens. That you either be quiet and do as you're told, or we're going to take care of you. That was their attitude. And this was the attitude of many of the Umayyad Khulafa, that you do as you're told, because we don't have time to worry about you, we're worrying about expanding the Muslim empire. So if you don't do as you're told, we're going to take care of you. The Abbasids, a lot of the Khulafa, they tolerated dissent. What did this result in? Well, what it resulted in is many independent kingdoms popping up all over the place every now and then. For example, the Seljuk Turks of Persia, they were a dynasty that lasted for a number of years, and they cut themselves off from the Abbasids. They established their own country and kingdom. And they were Muslim, but they just decided that, forget about him, let's just be independent. And the Umayyad dynasty of Spain. Now, what is the Umayyad dynasty of Spain? The Umayyads, they were finished in 749 Common Era. But the Umayyad dynasty of Spain, they were basically members of the Umayyad clan, the Umayyad family. And when Spain was conquered, Cordoba, this family, it seized power. And they remained the rulers of that part of Spain for a number of years. So these are when you hear of the Umayyads of Spain, this is who we're talking about. These are people who cut their ties. They were put in power by the Abbasids, but they became independent later on. Why? Because of the loose attitude of some of the Abbasid Khulafa. They were very easygoing. And not that sometimes, there were, because we're talking about 520 years. So some were easygoing, some were not so easygoing. There are many different khulafa that came in that time. But the general atmosphere at that time, the Hamdanid dynasty of northern Iraq and Syria, even today you see many of the people from Syria, their names are Hamdani. And even from parts of northern Iraq. So it's very possible that these individuals, they belong to that same family. And not that there's anything wrong with belonging to that family, but I'm just saying that Hamdanid dynasty, this was a dynasty that cut themselves off from the mainstream Abbasid the caliphate, and they established their own independence. But most of these people, they didn't last very long. That eventually they were dealt with, because you can't just establish a country in the middle of another country and expect to be there for very long. So some of them a couple of decades, some of them not even that long. The longest was probably the Umayyads of Spain. They lasted for a fairly long time. So these were the differences between the Abbasids and the Umayyads. So what was achieved during this golden era of Islam? This golden era of Islam, meaning the Abbasid dynasty, what was achieved was two things. What was achieved, meaning many things were achieved, but what was achieved, with regards to what we are studying today, two things were achieved during this time, this 520 years. The first thing that is of interest to us today is the codification of the sciences of hadith. The codification of the sciences of hadith means the hadith were now recorded, things that we have talked about in previous weeks. The science of al-jarh wa ta'adil, asma'ul rijal, all of these sciences that revolve around the science of hadith. That, how are we going to tell if a hadith is authentic or not? What level of authenticity does this hadith reach? All of these things, because the Abbasids, they financed the academic movement of that time, all of these things were done. So, scholars who devoted their lives to the study of any science, not necessarily just, Islam and hadith and things like that, any science. They were paid by the state, their operations were financed. We all know that the fifth Abbasid Khalifa, Harun al-Rashid, he established the famous Baytul Hikmah, the house of wisdom, in Baghdad, in the capital, Baghdad. And this was around until the fall of Baghdad. And this was, this was the center of learning in the civilized world of that time. This is where, books were being translated, the knowledge of the civilizations that neighbored the Muslims, it was being translated into Arabic. These scholars were studying, they were, they were debating, there were new things that were being found, new inventions being made, and all of this is being financed by the Abbasid Khulafa. So, this includes the science of hadith. The science of hadith, not necessarily always financed. It's not that, the Abbasid Khulafa paid Imam Bukhari to write Sahih al-Bukhari. That's not how it worked. But, it was an environment of learning. They weren't so concerned with expanding horizons as they were with this academic movement. So this was something that was very good. All of the four Imams, every single one of them, they they witnessed the Abbasid dynasty. Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah, he was born in the time of the Umayyads, but even the last 17 or 18 years of his life, he lived in the Abbasid dynasty. So, in its infancy, but nonetheless, he was there, and many of his students, they were even in positions of power in the Abbasid dynasty. All of us know one of the students of Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah was Imam Abu Yusuf. And Imam Abu Yusuf rahimahullah, he was appointed the Chief Justice. Right? So many of the rulings of Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah, when it comes to we were just talking about this, but when it comes to matters of qada, matters of meting out justice, hudud and things like this, matters that a court can decide. When the opinion of Imam Abu Yusuf and the opinion of his teacher Imam Abu Hanifa, they conflict, we give preference in this chapter, the chapter of the judicial system, to Imam Abu Yusuf rahimahullah. Why? Because he remained in this position for a very long time. And Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah, he was a scholar, he is the teacher of Imam Abu Hanifa, but he never physically actually became the qadi. He was never a judge. And Imam Abu Yusuf was. So we give preference to his opinions because he has hands-on experience. He was the judge for a very long time. So this is just one thing. And the remaining A'immah, they were all there during this time, during the Abbasid Caliphate, and the schools, they flourished in that time because it was a time of relative peace. There are always wars, and unfortunately wars are something that have plagued the Muslim society ever since the Shahada and the martyrdom of Sayyidina Uthman radiallahu ta'ala anhu. But it was a relatively peaceful time, so at least within the Muslim borders. So there was, knowledge was something that was easily exchanged, and it was a very easygoing environment in that regard. So this was the state of the Abbasid Khulafa. What happened later on, long story short, is that Baghdad, the center of the Muslim empire, was invaded by the Mongols. Who are the Mongols? The Mongols, they were a people who, today Mongolia, Siberia, that region over there, they came from there. The Mongols, we know his name in Persian is the father is Changiz Khan. In English we call him Genghis Khan. So he is the father. He's not the one who invaded Baghdad. His son in Farsi, his name is Halaku, and in English Helagu Khan. He is the one who invaded Baghdad. And that is a long story of what happened before and after and the things like that. But he is the one who invaded Baghdad. And there are many things that I can tell you about his invasion of Baghdad. It's very interesting to read how he used the science of deceit to bring the fall of the Muslim empire. This was one of the first occasions when an outside force used, and this is something that is not usually discussed in books of English history written by Western historians, but Helagu Khan is one of the first people that used the Shia-Sunni split to his advantage. And he convinced basically one of the advisors of the Abbasid, the Khalifa. His name was Abu Ahmad Abdullah Al-Mu'tasim. He's known as Al-Mu'tasim, but his name is Abu Ahmad Abdullah Al-Mu'tasim. He convinced one of the advisors of Mu'tasim, who happened to be Shia, that he convinced him to turn against the Khalifa. And he was central, his role, in getting the Khalifa to surrender. Not that the outcome would have been any different, because Helagu did have a very tight grip around the city by then, but he used it to his advantage, basically. He was one of the first in history. So that's something that's interesting. That's usually not something that's, not necessarily that the Western historians don't know about it. It's not of interest necessarily to them. So, but it is of interest to us, that this is one of the, they, Shia, Sunni, they were all living side by side. This was one of the first people who took advantage of this split. And this led to the fall of the Abbasid Khulafa, the Abbasid dynasty. And Baghdad was, Baghdad was invaded for 34 days. Baghdad was ransacked. And books of history, they bear testimony to this, that the books, the library of the Baytul Hikmah and the other libraries in Baghdad, huge libraries. I'll give you just an example. One of the scholars who ran away, because the Mongols, they were quite famous for what they had done in other parts of the world. So when the Muslims knew they were coming, they knew that trouble was coming. So some of the scholars, they managed to remove some of the manuscripts from some of these libraries. And one of the scholars, he is quoted in the books of history as saying that I transported 400,000 manuscripts from the Baytul Hikmah before the invasion of the Mongols, right? He transported 400,000 manuscripts. And when he says manuscripts, he doesn't mean something like this. He means, actual books that were handwritten, 400,000 of them, many of them in many volumes. He managed to get these out of Baghdad. What did remain in Baghdad at that time? This is something that when discussing the invasion of the Mongols, Western and Muslim historians agree that for days the water in the river Tigris ran black because from the ink, from the books that the Mongols dumped, because they were an illiterate people. They didn't respect knowledge. So the centuries of knowledge and tradition in all various sciences, they threw it into the river Tigris. They had no respect for this. Contrary to this, we know that when the British, they established their rule in the subcontinent, in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, that area of the world, we know that Mysore, anybody from, what is the closest city to Mysore? I can't remember the name of the city, but anyways, it's that tech, the tech capital of India. What's Bangalore? Bangalore. So Bangalore, Mysore is close to Bangalore. Mysore is the center of what many of us might have heard his name. His name was Tipu Sultan. Tipu Sultan. He was one of the last Indian kings to give up. He didn't actually give up. He was killed. So his territory, the territory of Mysore, it was one of the last to fall to the British. In that entire area, and the records indicate that he had hundreds of thousands of books in his palace, and many of them he had read himself. And the books that he had read, he would sign off on the front page. And I'm just the British, although they did invade the place and they did take over, and they did whatever they did, but they respected the knowledge that those books contained. So they didn't allow the plundering of the library. Armed guards were put in place, and the books that the library of Tipu Sultan contained, they were transported back to Britain. So these were the Brits. I'm not happy with what they did, but at least they respected the knowledge. The Mongols, on the other hand, centuries of knowledge, things that it took so long to compile, they just threw them in the Tigris. And we know this because many of our books today, they refer to other books, right? So for example, I'm writing a book and I'm going to refer in my book to another book, and we can't find that book. It's gone with the passing of time. And if we know the author lived at that time, because we didn't have the printing press. books were handwritten, and sometimes there was only one copy. If you wanted to read it, you go to wherever that book is and you read it over there. And if there's a passage or two that you are interested in, you record that passage. That's how knowledge was transmitted. So we know that many of these books were destroyed in the invasion of Baghdad in 1258. So this marked the end of an era. Hundreds of thousands of books were burned, were thrown into the river, and this is how a great portion of our inheritance was destroyed. And it's very unfortunate. And by the way, actually, these Mongols later on they did accept Islam. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala used them for the service of His religion, right? The Mughal Empire. Where did these people come from? They are descendants of the Mongols. The Mughal Empire in India. Well, at that time there was no India. It was all one. The entire subcontinent, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, all of this area, that was one country, one empire, and ruled for a period of time by the Mughal Empire. These were descendants. They were Muslim. They were descendants of these Mongols. So later on, their generations, they did accept Islam, and that just goes to tell us that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guides whom He wishes. That these same people that destroyed the center of the Muslim empire, they were later guided by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So now, from that time until today, what we really want to discuss. So this marked the end of the golden age. The destruction of Baghdad, it marked the end. Until that time, all four Sunni schools of fiqh had developed. And they were full-fledged schools with followers in various parts of the globe. And many things had been done. And much work had been, basically the way it worked is the Imams, sometimes they wrote, sometimes they didn't. I told you Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah, it's not known whether he authored his own, the few books that are attributed to him. It's not proven hard and fast that they were authored by the Imam himself. So, basically the knowledge of these Imams, it was carried forth by their students. And these students, they traveled, they went to various parts of the globe, they interacted with people of other schools, and this, this started a whole movement. And, many things were learned from one another. And by the fall of Baghdad, these schools were well established. And they had followers in various parts of the world. And yes, by this time, somebody was asking a week or two ago that in the beginning, yes, there was no such thing as a Hanafi. That, Imam Abu Hanifa didn't call himself the leader of the Hanafi movement or something. That's something that materialized later on. That people who followed his understanding and his interpretation, they were known as followers of the Hanafi school of fiqh. But by now there were. And this wasn't always pretty. The Hanafis and the Shafis are known to have had many debates, right? And our books are actually full of them. And I'm sure that I haven't read all of the Shafi'i texts, but I'm sure the Shawafi they are similar, because this was a time when this was what scholars used to do. That a Hanafi scholar and a Shafi'i scholar, if they get together, what else are they going to talk about? They're going to talk about the differences in their understandings of fiqh. So they used to debate one another, and these debates used to be lively. Sometimes these debates used to take place in the courts of these khulafa. That the Khalifa is probably bored or something. He would call a Shafi and a Maliki scholar, or a Shafi and a Hanafi scholar, and he would put out a question, and there we go. That's how they would entertain themselves. So, and he would pick the question. That's purposely something that he knows that they're not going to agree on. So this was done, and sometimes these debates were fruitful, sometimes they're not. Some scholars, judging by the way they wrote their books, it would even appear very slanderous, the things that they wrote about one another. That, for example, the Khatib al-Baghdadi, rahimahullah, he is known to be a very staunch critic of Imam Abu Hanifa, rahimahullah. And somebody actually wrote a refutation of the opinions of Khatib on Imam Abu Hanifa, rahimahullah. So basically, how this is what they used to do. So the Khatib Baghdadi, he doesn't agree with Imam Abu Hanifa. Now he's going to write a book refuting Imam Abu Hanifa. Now somebody gets a hold of that book, he's going to write a refutation of the refutation of Imam Abu Hanifa, rahimahullah. And that would go on. So this is very amusing. And we find these books now, that some of them that weren't destroyed, we see them today. And today we think that if these two individuals, they just sat down, many of these differences are trivial. They could have but unfortunately Khatib lived in one place and Imam Abu Hanifa lived in another place, so it's usually a word of mouth thing. So he heard that the Imam said this, and then he heard that he said this, and that's how it used to work, unfortunately. So all of this was already done. What happened after the fall of Baghdad is, later on, the Mamluks, they came, and then the Ottoman Empire later on. And we didn't need a new school. The job wasn't as hard as the Imams, they had it themselves. Nobody needed to now take a look at the entire collection of hadith and, put down rulings. And this wasn't what needs to be done now. What needed to be done after that, and what continues to be needed to do today, is that in light of this vast ocean of knowledge that these Imams and these scholars have left us, they have left us maxims, rules, regulations on how to derive rulings for newfound situations. So the scholars from the fall of Baghdad until now, their main responsibility is, number one, imparting the teachings left behind from these Imams, and number two is when new things arise. Like, for example, new things arise all the time, that answers are needed to, that the international monetary system today, it's unavoidable, and as you all know, it's based on interest. This is something that wasn't around at that time. It was very easy for the Muslim empire to have their own the financial system that was free from interest. But it's not easy today. That even if you have a Muslim country, they are bound to do trade within the international monetary system. The trade system, they have to. How are they going to get something that is made in Canada in a Muslim country? I'm not going to take any Muslim country by name, but in whatever that utopia is, that Muslim country that is run exclusively on the laws of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it's not possible. So solutions have to be put, that to what level can we engage with this system that is based on a non-Islamic principle, that interest is not permissible. So the scholars, they have done a lot of work, and there's still a lot of work remains, and the work is never going to complete. As new challenges present themselves, the scholars will have to sit down and address these challenges. And like many other things, there is not one size, there's no one size fits all solution. What can work here in Canada might not work in England or another Muslim country. So that is why we have the science of fiqh. In the first week, if you remember, I told you what fiqh is. Fiqh is the ever-evolving understanding, our understanding of the laws of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and how He wants us to live our lives. So as society evolves, as society moves on, as new challenges present themselves, it is the job of the learned individuals from the ummah, people who have dedicated their lives to this, to find the solutions that are not only applicable in textbooks, but in real life. That I could sit here and I could imagine something up, but if that is not going to help you in your real everyday life, that's not going to work. That's not a solution to the problem. So of course I can sit over here and say that the Muslim countries shouldn't be trading then with any other non-Muslim country. But unfortunately, that's in my world of my textbooks, and that's not how it's going to be done. There has to be a way around, some way we can fix this problem, because they have to trade with other countries. It's just something that's bound to happen. Not everything grows in the United Arab Emirates, for example. So. And not everything is made in Saudi Arabia. You have to get things that are made in other countries, and this ties into that system that is based on interest. So how can we deal with this? What is the solution? Can we work with the country? If the country is not willing to work with us, is there another way to work around this? How can we make it so that us Muslims, we can find a way out that is pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Now, are we always successful? No, we're not. Many things have yet to be solved. This is a primary example. No Muslim country to date has figured this out, that interest is something that is haram. How are they to work around it? No Muslim country has figured this out. No scholar has figured this out until today, because it's not something that's extremely easy to figure out. That many people have tried, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will reward them for their effort. But a solution that is applicable across the board, this hasn't happened until today. And I don't see it happening in the very near future. So things like this is what needs to be done today. Now, is it being done? Yes, of course it is. It is being done. A lot of effort is being put in various countries. In the Western context, we have many associations, many gatherings, conferences of scholars that sit down to put their heads together to try to solve the problems of their people in the North American context. And in the Arab world, we have conferences and scholars, entire organizations that are dedicated to this. We have schools in various parts of the world. Some of the more famous, well-known schools. There are schools in Saudi Arabia itself. The University of Medina Munawwara is one of the more famous. In Egypt, Al-Azhar University is considered an authority in Sunni Islam. In the subcontinent, Darul Deoband is considered an authority on Sunni Islam. These are the big guys. That's the big players. And there are certain organizations, certain conferences that are considered authorities. When a ruling comes from there, we give it a lot of weight. That, for example, in the subcontinent, we have the Fiqh Academy of India. These are scholars from all across India that sit down and try to solve. Usually the problems are applicable to their people, that part of the world, but not always. Sometimes they are applicable to other places as well. In North America, we have the North American Imams Association. So these scholars, they get together and they sit down, and on a local level, if we have a local problem, and some of us, we probably know some of the local problems we have. So our local scholars will get together and they will try to solve this problem. And the problem, whether solved or not, this is something that's very important for us to realize. And I will finish with this. What's very important for us to realize is that before we criticize any scholar, it is an established fact that just for trying, he is going to be rewarded, as long as he is sincere, or they are sincere in their effort. That if a new challenge presents himself, and these scholars, they are sincere in their effort to try to solve this, there is no other motivation besides the pleasure of Allah, then whether they get it right or wrong, Allah is going to reward them. If they get it right, they will be rewarded twofold. And if they get it wrong, they will still be rewarded for the effort that they put in. So, it's a huge responsibility. And, we have made mistakes. I can give you some of the more funny mistakes that, we would have been a century ahead in publishing our works, the classical works of fiqh, hadith, and things like this, if it weren't for certain fatwas that banned the printing press from the Muslim world. these are some of the things that when the radio first came out in Saudi Arabia, it was considered haram. Not even haram, it was considered to be sihr, it was considered to be black magic. But, how can somebody's voice be coming out of this lifeless box? This is black magic. And we laugh about it now, but that was our understanding at that time. And I'm sure if we were around at that time, as observing Muslims, we would have agreed with these scholars. Right? Yes, the Shaykh is saying, so it's true. Yes, it is something that we consider, something new that we consider haram. No, I can't think of any examples. But, all of us agree. And maybe, 200 years from now, the opinion might change. And people are going to laugh at us, those guys.
Even around 20 years ago, putting a video camera in the mosque was not considered fruitful.
That people might laugh at us 200 years from now, just like we're laughing at the coffee and the radio and things like this. So it's an ever-evolving understanding that all of these things, the ruling of whether a radio is permissible or not is not mentioned in the Quran, it's not mentioned in the Hadith. This is our understanding of what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants. And our understanding, because we are human beings, we make mistakes. Our understanding could be wrong. It could evolve over time. Right? And I could give you some more interesting examples as well, but that's not the point. The point over here is that those things, we understood them a certain way as, okay, I'll give you another example that's the opposite way around. When smoking first came, what was the ruling on smoking at that time? It was considered makruh, undesirable, not because of the health effects. We didn't know the health effects of smoking yet. Because the scholars of that time, they equated it with eating something that omits a foul odor, something like garlic or raw onions or something like that, and entering the mosque. So the ruling of that time, if you look at the fatwa of that time, they will say that smoking is undesirable before entering the mosque. Apart from that, you're fine. What's wrong with smoking? Right? Today, ask any scholar in the world, nobody is going to tell you that smoking is okay, because our understanding has evolved. New things have come in front of us. So, that was our understanding. We didn't know the health effects. All we knew is that it omits a foul odor, so you don't do that before you come into the mosque. So, therefore, it's undesirable immediately before entering the mosque. If you want to smoke, you go ahead and smoke. And something that probably a lot of us don't. Many of our scholars did smoke. Okay, so they were smokers. All of them were heavy smokers. Because at that time, that was the ruling, right? So, smoking was considered okay. So, this is our understanding. Our understanding is constantly evolving. Even today, our understanding of many things is evolving. Many things, I could give you some rather controversial examples, but I won't, because many of these things are still undergoing research. Some things that were considered haram, many of you probably still think they are haram. With the coming of modern research, we are discovering that might not be the case. I'm talking in the world of ingredients here. That there are many ingredients that we originally presumed to be, now the health effects, that's not what of course we should eat natural, but there are many ingredients that we originally thought were haram, but based on new research that comes forth, we now believe that some of these might be halal, because the process that they undergo when making these ingredients might make them halal. I'm not giving examples. Because this research is still ongoing. I don't want anybody to take my word for this. But things like this, our understanding is constantly evolving, and we should respect the process. That if something was different yesterday, and the scholars, they have decided after the research that it should be changed, we shouldn't question. When I say we shouldn't question, of course we can question that, how this came about. Right? That part is okay. But criticizing them, that for example, that so what, we were doing it wrong all this time, or my dad died doing it wrong, right? That's not the attitude that we're looking for, right? There are, I'm sure many of you could think of examples in our context here in BC, that things in the recent past that might have changed. The people, this was their attitude. So what, we were wrong all these years, since I was 5 years old, I'm praying at a certain time, I was wrong. Or you weren't wrong. That was your understanding at that time. And now, based on the evidence and the research that we have now, the understanding has changed, therefore the time has changed. Right? Okay, I just put it right out there for you. I'm talking about the time, the recent changes in the schedule. That was our understanding at that time. And no, your father or your grandfather didn't die doing it wrong. They did right according to that time. And now we have new research, new understanding, so we will do it according to this time. And that's just the way it works. And we have to be ready to accept that. Otherwise, if we weren't ready to, imagine we weren't ready to accept this in other spheres of life. That a couple of 100 years ago, your grandfather wrote in his diary, or your great grandfather, that the world is flat. And you're saying, he died thinking it was flat. Well, it's round now, it's not going to work. Right? Imagine people think like this. So why do we think like this when it comes to our understanding? Do you find anybody in the world right now that still thinks the world is flat? No, you don't. But does that mean that those people at that time, they were stupid? No, they weren't. They understood according to their understanding. And as the understanding evolved, the new things came to light. Otherwise, we would get nowhere, absolutely nowhere. With every new discovery in the field of science, if the entire world were to question that, so what, we were wrong all this time, so that wouldn't get us anywhere, and this is not going to get us anywhere. We have to have a forward thinking attitude. So Jazakumullahu khairan for showing up, and this was my attempt at showing you the history of the development of the Islamic legal system. Now, to what degree I was successful, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. I hope there was something that everybody learned from this. If you didn't learn anything else, then I hope at least we can come to understand the great lengths that our scholars went to give us what we have today, and appreciate this. And if this is all that we got from this course, then that is enough, inshallah. So Jazakumullah khairan.